No one in the ballroom paid much attention to her when she first stepped inside, and that in itself was nothing unusual because she had learned long ago how to enter rooms quietly, how to make herself smaller beside a man who loved attention and praise, how to exist in the background while his presence filled the space. And tonight was no different, at least not at first. She stood half a step behind him as he greeted colleagues, investors, and executives, watching him switch into the confident version of himself that only appeared in professional spaces, shoulders straight, smile practiced, voice calm and assured. The kind of man people trusted with money and reputations, while she held her clutch with both hands and waited for anyone, to ask who she was. Eventually someone did. A senior partner from another firm smiled politely and said, "And you are?" She expected naturally that her husband would say her name, maybe even add that she had worked in the industry once, that she understood the business, that she had helped him through difficult years when his career was still uncertain, but instead he laughed lightly, the way people do when they think they are being charming, and said, "Oh, she just helps me out, keeps things organized, like my personal assistant. Or my maid, really. I'd be lost without her." There was a pause, not long enough to cause discomfort, not dramatic enough to draw attention, but long enough for the words to settle into the air, long enough for her to feel them land, heavy and humiliating, right in the center of her chest. A few people laughed awkwardly. Others smiled without reacting. No one corrected him, and she, standing right there, said nothing. Not because she agreed, not because she didn't feel the sting, but because years of marriage had taught her that contradicting him in public only led to accusations of being dramatic, sensitive, difficult, and she had learned painfully that silence was often the easier path, even when it cost her something inside. So she smiled and swallowed the humiliation. As the evening continued, he moved through the crowd collecting compliments and opportunities, while she stayed near the edges of conversations, invisible again, watching the people in the room with the quiet attention of someone who no longer expects to be seen. What no one there knew, including her own husband, was that she had once worked closely with the company hosting the gala, that years ago she had been part of projects that helped build the very network he was now trying to impress, that she had stepped away from that world not because she lacked skill, but because she had chosen to support his unstable career when his future was uncertain and hers was just beginning to grow. She had traded her momentum for his stability, and now standing in that ballroom, she realized that he didn't see that sacrifice as partnership. He saw it as convenience. Still, she did not plan anything. She did not confront him. She did not speak to anyone about the insult. She simply stood there, holding her glass, breathing slowly, trying to remain composed, unaware that only minutes later, the attention of the entire room would shift toward her, not because of him, but because of a truth he had never expected to face in public. At the front of the ballroom, the CEO of the hosting company stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone gently, calling for attention, and as the conversation softened and people turned toward the lights, no one noticed the way her husband straightened his jacket, confident that whatever was about to happen would only further support the image he had been carefully building all evening. He had no idea that his name was not the one about to be called. When the CEO began to speak, his voice calm and confident, thanking partners, investors, and longtime collaborators for their continued trust and shared success. Most people listened with polite attention, expecting the usual sequence of acknowledgments, handshakes, and professional gratitude, while her husband adjusted his posture slightly, already preparing his smile, already imagining how he would be perceived when his name eventually came up among those who mattered. But instead of calling executives or department heads, the CEO paused, glanced down at his notes, and said a name that only a few people in the room immediately recognized. Her name. At first, she thought she had imagined it, that perhaps the sound of the crowd or the echo in the hall had distorted what she heard. But when the CEO looked directly toward her side of the room and repeated it more clearly, inviting her to come forward, there was no longer any doubt that the moment unfolding belonged to her, not to the man standing beside her. She froze, not out of pride or excitement, but out of disbelief, because the last thing she expected, especially after being reduced to a joke only minutes earlier, was to be publicly acknowledged in a space where her presence had just been dismissed. Around her, heads turned, whispers spread quickly. People searched their memories, trying to connect the name with faces, projects, companies, and suddenly, the quiet woman who had been standing near the edges of conversations became the center of the room's attention. Her husband's expression changed instantly. The confidence that had shaped his face all evening faltered, replaced by confusion, then discomfort, then something close to alarm, as if he sensed that whatever was about to happen was not part of the story he had prepared for himself. She hesitated, looking briefly at him, not for permission, but out of habit, the reflex of years spent considering his comfort before her own. And for a brief second, he seemed unable to speak, unable to process the reality that the stage he had assumed was reserved for him was now calling for her instead. Then slowly, she moved forward. Each step toward the stage felt unreal, as if she were walking through a memory from another life, one where she had not chosen invisibility, where her professional identity had not been set aside for the sake of supporting someone else's ambition. And as she climbed the short stairs and stood under the lights, she felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on her, not with judgment, but with curiosity and expectation. The CEO greeted her warmly, not formally, but with familiarity, and that alone shifted the atmosphere, because people could sense that this was not a random introduction or a polite gesture, but the acknowledgement of someone who mattered to the organization. He spoke about her past work, about projects she had led, about decisions she had influenced that still affected the company's success today, about her role in building partnerships that were now being celebrated as major achievements. And with every sentence, the gap between who she truly was and how her husband had just described her grew wider and more impossible to ignore. In the crowd, her husband stood perfectly still. Some people turned to look at him, others whispered behind their hands. And in that quiet, uncomfortable space between applause and realization, the truth began to take shape, not as an accusation, not as confrontation, but as something far more powerful and far more humiliating. A contrast between the woman being honored on stage and the way she'd been reduced to a joke moments before, between her dignity and his arrogance, between what he thought he knew about her and what everyone else was now discovering. She did not speak badly about him. She did not correct his earlier comment. She did not even mention their relationship. She simply thanked the CEO, spoke briefly about teamwork, about resilience, about the importance of supporting people when their paths are uncertain, and in those carefully chosen words, there was a quiet strength that needed no explanation, because the room understood. And sometimes, understanding is far more devastating than accusation. As she returned to the crowd after stepping down from the stage, she could feel the atmosphere around her shift in subtle but unmistakable ways, because people who had barely noticed her presence earlier were now approaching with polite smiles, with curiosity, with a sudden respect that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with what they had just learned about her. Several executives spoke to her directly, asking about her previous work, her perspective on current projects, her ideas for future collaborations. And with every conversation, the contrast grew sharper, because earlier that evening she had been introduced as someone who merely helped out. And now she was being treated as a professional whose experience mattered. He watched this from a distance, his expression tight, his posture stiff, realizing too late that he had publicly minimized someone whose credibility was now being validated by the very people whose approval he valued most. For the first time that night, he tried to interrupt, to reinsert himself into conversations, to remind people that he too belonged in these circles. But something had changed, and while no one was rude, no one returned the spotlight to him either, as if the narrative he had carefully constructed had quietly slipped out of his control. She did not look at him with triumph. She did not seek eye contact to measure his discomfort. She simply remained composed, grounded in a dignity that did not need reaction or performance, and that calm, more than any sharp remark could have, made the imbalance between them impossible to ignore. When they finally left the gala, applause and conversation still echoing behind them, he walked faster than usual, eager to escape the space where he had felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, reduced to the background of someone else's story. In the car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set, while she stared out the window, watching the city lights blur together, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity settle inside her, as if something long unspoken had finally been acknowledged by the world, even if not yet by him. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that whatever had happened in that ballroom was not something that could be dismissed as an awkward moment or a misunderstanding, because respect, once publicly questioned, rarely returns quietly. And as the silence stretched between them, heavy and unresolved, it became clear that this was not just the end of an evening, but the beginning of a reckoning that would reach far beyond that single humiliating joke. After that night, subtle changes became impossible to ignore. Colleagues who once invited him to informal meetings now kept conversations strictly professional. Opportunities he expected to receive without question were suddenly delayed or quietly given to others. People still treated him politely, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a cautious distance that suggested something fundamental had shifted in how he was perceived. Trust, once damaged, rarely announces its departure. It simply stops opening doors. At home, the tension grew heavier. He became more irritable, more critical, more restless, while she grew quieter, not out of fear, but out of clarity, realizing that the man she had defended for years was now revealing himself without any effort on her part. She no longer argued to be understood. She simply observed. And what she observed was a pattern she could no longer unsee. His need to feel superior, his discomfort when her competence became visible, his instinct to minimize what he could not control. The gala had not created these traits, it had only exposed them. Eventually, the conversation he had been avoiding arrived, not dramatically, not with raised voices, but with a tired honesty that neither of them had energy to resist anymore. He admitted that he felt threatened by her success, that he had grown comfortable in a marriage where he was the obvious center of attention, and that seeing her recognized publicly had made him feel replaceable, insignificant, as if the world was suddenly reminding him that he was not the only one capable of ambition or achievement. But even in that confession, there was no real remorse, only discomfort, only wounded pride. And she understood then that love cannot survive where respect is conditional, where support depends on one person remaining smaller so the other can feel bigger. She began to emotionally detach, not with cruelty, not with revenge, but with the quiet acceptance that sometimes the end of a relationship does not come from betrayal or scandal, but from the slow realization that you are no longer safe being fully yourself beside the person who promised to stand with you. Meanwhile, whispers about that night at the gala continued to circulate. Not because she encouraged them, not because she told her side of the story, but because people who witness imbalance cannot always forget it. And once someone sees behind the curtain of charm, it becomes difficult to pretend it was never lifted. His image, so carefully maintained, was now carrying small cracks that no amount of confidence could completely hide. And the more he tried to control how others saw him, the more obvious it became that control was slipping. For her, something else was happening. An old confidence, long dormant, was returning. Not loudly, not suddenly, but steadily, as if a part of her that had been waiting patiently finally understood that it was allowed to exist again. She began reconnecting with former colleagues, exploring professional opportunities, imagining a future that did not require shrinking herself to protect someone else's pride. And while he was desperately trying to regain a status that was no longer guaranteed, she was quietly building something far more stable: independence. What finally ended their marriage was not the night at the gala, and not even the arguments that followed, but the slow and irreversible shift in how she saw him. Because once respect is lost, love no longer has a stable ground to stand on, and no amount of shared history can rebuild what was quietly destroyed by repeated disregard. When she told him she wanted to separate, he was convinced at first that she was bluffing, that she was reacting emotionally, that with enough time she would calm down and return to the familiar rhythm of supporting his life while postponing her own. But when weeks passed and her resolve did not weaken, when he realized she was actively preparing for independence instead of reconciliation, panic began to replace his confidence. He tried different strategies. At times he was apologetic, promising to change, promising to respect her more, promising that the gala had been a misunderstanding, a poorly chosen joke, a mistake that should not define their entire relationship. But remorse that appears only when consequences arrive is rarely rooted in true understanding. And soon apologies turned into blame. He accused her of abandoning him when things were difficult, of sabotaging his reputation by allowing others to see what he had always been, of becoming someone he no longer recognized, as if her growth were a betrayal rather than a survival. Professionally, the damage continued quietly. He was no longer invited into inner circles where real decisions were made. Promotions went to others. Partnerships dissolved before they were ever formally discussed. In business, perception is often as powerful as performance, and once people begin to question your character, competence alone rarely saves you. He blamed bad luck. He blamed politics. He blamed everyone except himself. And in that constant externalization of responsibility, she saw clearly why their marriage could not survive. When the legal separation was finalized, there was no dramatic courtroom confrontation, no public scandal, no final speech where hidden truths were finally shouted into the open. Instead, there was paperwork, formal language, and the quiet, administrative ending of a relationship that had already emotionally ended long before the signatures were placed on the page. She walked out of that office not feeling victorious, not relieved, but steady, grounded, unafraid. Months later, when their lives had fully separated, when their social circles barely overlapped anymore, when his career still struggled to recover while hers slowly, patiently grew, he attempted one final conversation, asking if she truly believed that everything that had happened was fair, if she really thought he deserved the consequences he was now living with. She did not argue. She did not justify. She simply told him that fairness had never been her goal, that all she had wanted was respect, and when that was repeatedly denied, she chose to remove herself from a situation that demanded her silence as the price of belonging. And that was the last time they spoke. What he lost was not just a marriage. He lost the quiet support that had protected him from his own worst tendencies. He lost the woman who had believed in him before anyone else did. He lost the stability that had allowed him to take risks, to grow, to succeed. What she gained was not revenge. It was alignment between who she was and how she was treated, between her abilities and her opportunities, between her voice and her choices. She did not rise through humiliation. She rose through refusal. Refusal to stay small. Refusal to be a supporting character in a story where she had done so much of the work. Refusal to accept that love must be proven through endurance rather than mutual respect. And while he continued to explain his downfall as bad timing and unfortunate misunderstandings, she moved forward without needing to explain herself to anyone, building a life where her value was not a secret and her presence was not negotiable. In the end, the most painful lesson he learned was not that he had underestimated her, but that once someone outgrows the need to be seen by you, there is nothing left to control. And the most powerful lesson she learned was simple and irreversible. She never needed his permission to become who she was meant to be.